I want to talk a bit about why organizational change is not an engineering problem. So let's set up the situation where we have maybe a performance curve of an organization. And so people see this, and obviously they're not too happy. They want to move to a higher level of performance. So then they come in and they identify a few things that they want changed. So first of all, they may say that, this practice of doing canvassing is something that they're not doing well, that they need to implement. They can also say, oh, our retrospectives are no good, and that these need to be improved as well. So do the canvases, do the retrospectives, and finally, maybe it's the lack of story mapping that is causing them to have problems when they have new projects that come that they need to work on. So go do some story mapping and learn how to do this practice a bit better. So we have a couple of these practices that they've identified to move to a new level. And the assumption is if you do this, or if you do these things, your performance will then improve. Now, one of the problems that I'm going to tell you about is when that's the approach that's taken and there is not the improvement that is hoped for, a solution focus is sort of limited in that the problem is going to be identified with, well, something about the solution we've brought in is not working. And if we wanted people to do canvassing and it's not working, well, maybe we just need to get a bit better at canvassing. Or maybe the retrospectives, we're doing them, but they need to be better. And story mapping, again, these things are the solution, right? So they should work. There must be something wrong with how we're doing it. But unfortunately, the real problem here is that organizational change and making these sorts of improvements is not causal. So that means you can't use deductive logic. So you can't say if A, then B. If I A, do these things, then B, my performance will improve. So one of the reasons why this is not a good idea, this is an engineering-based approach to change. It has a couple assumptions built in that people and organizations work like computers. And we just need to get them doing the right things, and then we'll be moving into the right direction. So this is a sort of result of trying to apply, a solution with a lot of structure. So the idea here is that, well, if we can find the right patterns and the right examples and the right structure from, say, best practices or case studies, that will be a nice, well-formed solution that has a base, that has some foundation, which, again, logically makes sense, which will lead us to the improvements. But the structure only really helps in developing two things, which are A, some sunk costs, and emotional resistance. Because the person who brought in the best practices based off the case studies, who maybe sort of pitched the organization that if we do these things, things will get better, and recommended these practices, once the change doesn't happen, there's a lot of backpedaling that has to be done. So So that does not work. And things will go that way up until the point when some sort of crisis occurs. Now, what do we do instead? So instead of structure, one thing we can start looking at are constraints. And when we take a constraints-based approach to making change in an organization, what we can try looking at are two things. We have the sort of the modules. So these can be your teams, these can be your organizations. And then you have your connections. So how these groups of people or teams are connected with one another, and how they're maybe divided, and what purpose they're sort of driving towards within the organization. Now, the constraints mean you're putting some basic heuristics in place that let each of the groups develop their own particular solutions based off their context and based off the results they're getting. I hope that was helpful. Thank you very much.